welcome to this third podcast of books that I read in 2025. There's a couple of odd ones in here, so let's get started. Fast Money, the backroom deals, corporate espionage, and legendary power struggles that drive Formula One. Christian Silt and Caroline Reed. The first motorsport book I read last year. Actually, no, it wasn't. It was the second motorsport book I read last year. It was published on August the 19th, 2025. It is a book all about the ins and outs of Formula One, how it works, really how it works, not just how you think it works. And the title says it all, the backroom deals, corporate espionage, legendary power struggles. And that's what it's about, the history of Formula One and how the constructors, Bernie, and also into the Liberty Media era. Some of the deals that were done and some of the unscrupulous practices, some of the foolish decisions made by the team owners that lost them millions over decades. Because when Bernie came in and offered them a share, they all turned around and said, no, we'll leave it to you, we just want to race. Which may have seemed like a good thing at the time, but over the decades, they've lost out billions. What I wrote when I read this in early July was, I love Formula One, I have done for as long as I remember. Being old, I go back to the 1960s, when coverage was mostly reading about it and seeing the occasional edited clip package on the news or grandstand or world of sport. Over the decades, I've read numerous biographies, autobiographies, reminiscences, and books about the history of motorsport. I have never encountered a book quite like this one. Fast Money is not so much about the drivers, tracks, owners, and personalities at the sharp end. This is about the business of F1 and how it became what it is from a business point of view. This is really behind the scenes business side of things. As complicated as some of the shenanigans have been, Fast Money explains it in detail, but with remarkable clarity. If you want to know how F1 works, or want to know why it is like it is, this is a must-read. Phenomenal read, and surprisingly unputdownable. And I think I still stand by that. That does sum it up. It is a very, very well-written, well-explained book, and it takes some things that really are complicated and explains them in a way that is reasonably easy to understand. Some of the deals that old Bernie did. Oh my God. Oh, it'll make your toes curl up. But yeah, if you're into Formula One and want to know how it got to where it is today and why it is such a profit-based business and how it became such, because you've got to remember the Formula One didn't start out being all about money. All motorsport really, although it started at the turn of the 20th century, it really took off after the First World War, because a lot of the flyboys and daredevils coming back from World War One wanted something to do, because they'd been out there and doing stuff, and they came back and it was really boring, so they took cars and souped them up and started racing them very fast. And that is how modern motorsport really, essentially, became what it is. But it was never, in the early days, about the money. It was a gentleman's sport, and rich people did it. Poor people did it on a much different level. They still did it. And as Enzo Ferrari called these people the garagistas, people like Colin Chapman, Frank Williams, they were doing it on a different level. They were doing it on a shoestring budget, making deals, and whereas the Ferraris, the Mercedes, the big teams, they were doing it for prestige, to show how great they were. Whereas the little guys, they were doing it just to beat the big guys. And at some point, Bernie Ecclestone, whatever you feel about Bernie, his own story is very, very interesting. The guy was a born salesman. So anyway, if you are into Formula One and not just a casual observer of the odd race here and there, if you want to understand it more, this is a most excellent addition to any library. Fast Money, the backroom deals, corporate espionage, legendary power struggles that drive Formula One by Christian Silt and Caroline Reed. Okay, The Hilliker Curse, My Pursuit of Women by James Elroy. I gave this a 3-star review because I'm a huge fan of James Elroy and have been for decades now. I've got everything he's ever written, pretty much, apart from a few books that I've not been able to get hold of. I would class myself as a huge fan of his writing. All of his books are quite difficult. Some of them are pretty gruesome and tough, but fantastic writer. And so I thought, well, yeah, autobiography. I do love a good autobiography. And in this case, I thought, yeah, James Elroy, that'll be interesting because, you know, his history and death of his mother and all that. And I thought, yeah, well, I'm looking forward to reading that. So when I read it, I was thinking it's excruciating to read because as much of as a literary genius as the man might be, he seems to be a thoroughly unpleasant person. And, you know, a couple of years ago I read the recent biography of Steve Marriott, and I'm a huge fan of Steve Marriott, Humble Pie and all that. I read the book and I thought, I still love his music, and he created some incredible stuff, and I still love that. However, the guy was a real twat, and if I'd been around him, I would have decked his ass. I wouldn't have put up with this shit. I would have smacked him. I had a similar sort of thing. As much as I love James Elroy's books, I respect his talent as a writer. As a person, what a dick. I mean, what a total dick. And that's not something that's recent. He's always been a dick from being a kid. And I don't think he can use the excuse of, well, oh, my mother was murdered. And he was a dick before that. You know? He's always been a complete twisted cock. Would I recommend anybody to read this book? It's not a pleasant book to read. In fact, it's very uncomfortable reading. I don't know whether it explains the man or... I don't think it does. I think he's just a cock. So, anyway, there you go. The Hilliker Curse. Read it at your own peril. What I actually wrote was pure Elroy. Autobiography written in hard-boiled gumshoe style. What more can you ask for? And it is. And if I kind of justify it to myself as I read it as one of his books rather than being an autobiography. Because if you read it as an autobiography, you think, what a thoroughly unpleasant man. If you read it as one of his books, then, yeah, you think, what a thoroughly unpleasant character. Because the reality of it actually being him, I don't know, it kind of shatters the illusion, really. I'd prefer to think of that he's not actually like that. That was just a character. Because if that's what he was really like, I would have smacked him as well. There you go. The Hilliker Curse, My Pursuit of Women. Uncanny Bodies, The Coming of Sound Film and the Origins of the Horror Genre by Robert Spadoni. I guess this falls into the category of being one of those weird books that I like to read from time to time. And anybody who's checked out my podcast in the past or even just listened to one of my radio shows probably figured out that I am a huge silent movie fan. I guess it was because they were still showing these things in the 70s when I was a kid. There was something about them. You don't have the soundtrack other than sort of maybe a piano or organ or something like that. But you don't have the words. You have to look at these things and you pay more attention to the imagery. There's just something about these films. They were just so stylish, some of them. And if you watch any of the old silent films, some of them are quite saucy. Anything pre-1935, pre-code, can be quite saucy, some more than others. The later silent films in the late 1920s, the quality of the pictures was actually really very good. And when they actually made the move to the talking pictures, it had several effects that were, I guess, unforeseen, in that a lot of the silent actors and actresses didn't make the cut because their voices just didn't sound good. Quite a few of them had come over from Europe and they couldn't speak English very well. Some of them just had really squeaky voices, and the technology had an effect also. The whole history of the movies is something that fascinates me. This particular book, I know it doesn't sound much of a laugh, I guess, but I'll read you the blurb. It says, in 1931, Universal Pictures released Dracula and Frankenstein, two films that inaugurated the horror genre in Hollywood cinema. These films appeared directly on the heels of Hollywood's transition to sound film. Uncanny Bodies argues that the coming of sound inspired more in these massively influential horror movies than screams, creaking doors, and howling wolves. A close examination of the historical reception of films of the transition period reveals that sound films could seem to their earliest viewers unreal and ghostly. By comparing the audience impression to the first sound horror films, Robert Spadoni makes a case for understanding film viewing as a force that can powerfully shape both the minutest aspects of individual films and the broadest sweeps of film production trends, and for seeing after effects of the temporary weirdness of sound film deeply etched in the basic character of one of our most enduring film genres. And that basically says it all, really. Because when the first sound films came in, they not only had to contend with, would your voice work? Did you have a heavy European accent? Did your voice sound high-pitched and squeaky? Because the recording techniques for the sound were not at all sophisticated. It also meant that actual filming the films was very much different, because the cameras had to be isolated in soundproof booths, which meant that some of the early sound films were actually quite static, whereas some of the later silent films have been a lot more mobile. Also, the actual technique of getting the sound onto the film and synchronized meant that the picture quality suffered. So some of the early sound movies, the picture quality is really quite shit compared to the late silent movies, where the picture quality was really quite something. Look at something like Wings, for example. Some of the camera work in that is absolutely spectacular, and the quality of the image is really excellent. So on July the 24th, 2025, what I wrote was, if you are even considering reading this, you will definitely own an anorak. Furthermore, you will understand what it's all about from the title. I rather enjoyed it. I'd actually thought about this quite a bit already, and he makes some good points I hadn't considered before. Not for everyone, but if you are in touch with your inner nerd, it's well worth the effort. It's more of a long essay or article at 130 pages. And I did really enjoy this book by Robert Spadoni, but like I said, it's not for everyone. But for me, yeah, I really enjoyed it. And the Alfa Romeo, and Jimmy Murphy and the White Duesenberg by Dan Carter, with illustrations by Raymond Briggs. Yes, that Raymond Briggs. Now, there is a story to this. I have told this elsewhere, but what the hell, I'm going to recount it here. Back in the 1960s, when I first started school, I didn't like school much when I first went. My mum took me to school and I cried for the first week or so. I really didn't stop. I hated school. I didn't want to go to school. I was having lots of fun not going to school, and I really did sort of think that it was the end of the world, and I thought, it was the cruelest possible thing to take kids away from the things that they were doing. They were learning stuff. They were having a nice time. There was people who cared about them and they loved. And you send them to these places where they're thrown together with people they don't know, they don't like. It's just not fun. School is a horrible thing. I did not like. I cried and cried. I wouldn't shut up. So in the end, what they did was they put me in the library. And close me in there. I was inconsolable. I just didn't want to be there. And if I'd have had the ability, I was only 5. If I'd have had the ability, I would have run away. I was stuck in the library, and after about a day and a half of sitting in the library crying my eyes out, I started looking around. And before I'd gone to school, my mum got in trouble when she first took me because for about a year before I started school, I'd been able to read because my mum had bought Philips reel-to-reel tape recorder, recorded books and stuff onto the tape recorder, and then showed me how to use the tape recorder, which created two monsters, my love of books and reading and my love of electronic equipment. So I could already read when I got to school. My mum got told off because it was going to do untold damage, because how were they going to teach me to read? As my mum told me, well, you don't need to teach him to read, he can already read. The irony of that would be when firstborn girl child went to school, guess what? She could already read. Her mum, on delivering firstborn girl child to school, got a stiff telling off from the headmistress, who went on to say it doesn't matter if they can't spell, which we've never really forgotten. I was sat in the library looking around thinking, woe is me, I'm going to spend, the next 15 years of my life in this kind of establishment, what am I going to do? And I looked around and I thought, oh, books. And it sort of took a while I was very bright, but it took me about a day and a half to realise I was surrounded by shitloads of books. So looking around the shelves, I came across one particular book, actually two particular books, that just, I don't know why they said something to me. One of my things as a kid was I was fascinated by cars, toy cars, real cars. I knew all the cars on the road. You could show me any car at 5 years old and I could tell you what make it was. And I loved watching what motorsport there was on TV. So I was a petrol head way before I could drive. I was looking around and I saw these books, Nuvolari and the Alfa Romeo, Jimmy Murphy and the White Duesenberg. I took these books off the shelves and I read them. What I have recently discovered is when I started school in 1968, these books were actually brand new. They had just been published. So I was possibly the first person to read these books. I wouldn't let anyone else near them. I was very territorial of them. And I just love them. And Nuvolari, for me, is still the greatest. Because you ask any racing driver today, who's your hero? And they will say, Lewis Hamilton. You ask Lewis Hamilton, he will say Senna. You ask Senna, he would have said Fangio. Fangio, his hero was Nuvolari. The Flying Mantuan. I just love the story of Nuvolari and the 1935 German Grand Prix. And also the Jimmy Murphy and the White Duesenberg story. I just love these books. And I recently discovered that about 20 years ago, they were actually reprinted. Those have been out of print for decades. So I found a copy on eBay and I bought it. And I've recently read it. And I enjoyed it as much as when I first read it all those decades ago. What I didn't know at the time, all the illustration were actually by Raymond Briggs, who would go on to create Fungus the Bogeyman, who I was an awfully big fan of, and also the Snowman. So it was a bit of a joyful moment when I received my copy of this late last year, and I was overjoyed to read these again. So I read these in November, and what I said was, I think that this is one of the first books that made me love reading motorsport all at the same time. I first read these books back in 1968, recently purchased this beautiful reissue from my library. And then there is a link to my Substack, which tells the story of what I've just told you. I don't expect anybody here to go out and buy the thing, although I will include the link to my Substack article. These just mean so much to me, and I was overjoyed to find these and buy these. And they weren't exactly cheap either, but it is a beautiful copy. It's a little box thing with both books in, and it's exactly as I remember it. They've been faithfully reproduced in the original format. Beautiful. One of my most prized possessions, this. So there you go, Nuvolari and the Alfa Romeo and Jimmy Murphy and the White Duesenberg. Red Side Story by Jasper Fforde. Shades of Grey #2. It's the UK, but not as we know it. Civilization has rebuilt after an unspoken something that happened 500 years before, and society is now colour-based. Strict levels of hierarchy dictated by the colours you can see, and the economy, health service and citizens' aspirations all dominated by visual colour, run by a shadowy national colour in far-off Emerald City. That's what the blurb says. And I'm a huge fan of Jasper Fforde. First got into his stuff with the Air Affair 25 years ago now. I've read everything that he's written, and I absolutely love his writing, his ingenuity, his creativity, and just his style. I wish I was that good. So this is the story of Eddie Russett and Jane Grey. Everything is dictated by your vision of colour. There's like a caste system in society. So depending on the colours you can see where you are in the caste system. It's a story of Jane and Eddie and their adventures in this almost like the world that we know but not quite. So what I wrote June 26, 2025, I figured you either love Jasper Fforde's writing or you don't. I doubt there is much space on the fence to sit and wonder. I adore his weird tales set in an almost familiar world with all the same problems, just a bit twisted but recognisable all the same. This second part of the story of the chromatically challenged concludes the story begun in Shades of Grey. Very clever stuff and a brilliant way of getting some interesting concepts across. As ever, once you start one of his books, it doesn't last long enough and it's just so damn readable. If you are a fan, it will not disappoint. I adore his writing. I really do. He does address some of the problems that we face, but in his alternative world, and you can see what he's saying, and it's very, very clever stuff. It really is, and I thoroughly enjoy it. I appreciate that it takes him a while to write the books, but now I'm waiting till next year to be able to read dark reading matter, and I have to find something else in the meantime to satisfy my cravings. Jasper Fforde, Red Side Story, love it. Rowdy, the Roddy Piper story by Ariel Teal Toombs and Colt Baird Toombs. The previous year I read Bret Hart's autobiography Hitman. I knew a lot of the stuff that was in there, and it's 600 pages, there was an awful lot of stuff I didn't know. And I thought Bret Hart's book was probably the best pro wrestling biography that I've read, and it was a really great book. This book, Rowdy, the story of Roddy Piper, it was started by Roddy, but then he died, so it was unfinished. His children, Ariel and Colt, have finished it off, and it was published originally in 2016. I read this was another one that I read whilst I was down at Firstborns over the summer, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. I was a big fan of Roddy Piper. I always liked his shtick. So what I wrote on July the 2nd, 2025 was, of course, this is only of interest if you watch wrestling when you were younger, or you are a fan of They Live. I remember Roddy Piper from his stints in the WWF and the WCW, as well as his starring role in the aforementioned cult film. I always enjoyed his participation as it added a little zing. I did not know anything about what came before or after the wrestling, so this did have a lot of stuff I didn't know. Started by Roddy, he sadly died before completing it, and it is finished by his son and daughter. This is a well-written, informative autobiography that contains a lot of detail and is a really enjoyable read. It is easily on a par with his friend Bret Hart's excellent autobiography and is a welcome addition to the library. And it is. There was an awful lot of stuff about his early life, and he had one hell of an upbringing. I mean, seriously. It's a wonder he didn't end up in jail as a serial killer, really. It's a good read. If you are into wrestling, you remember the 90s, when professional wrestling in the US was what I think was at its peak in the late 90s. This is definitely something you want to read. Dark Side of the Moon, Werner von Braun, The Third Reich and the Space Race by Wayne Biddle. This book, let me just read it. It's about Werner von Braun. We all know who he was. I read this during the summer when I was down at Firstborns. I read it, most of it, lying on the sun lounger in the back garden. And I got a horribly burnt foot, actually. But that's an entirely different story. And what I wrote on July the 4th, 2025 was, I did find this an enjoyable read, as far as it goes. Whilst it does provide, I believe, important background historical context to the evolution of von Braun's empire, and places events in context with, and it did place the achievements in perspective with contemporaneous events. However, Biddle fails to expand in so many areas. For example, he is one of the few to mention General Hans Kammler's part in their escape from Germany, but he fails to expand on it, which is what we were reading the book to find out about. Every chapter here leaves you feeling, yes, and go on, tell me more about that. He fleetingly mentions Robert Goddard in passing, and never mentions Jack Parsons at all. Did von Braun not know of their activities, not care, or consider them insignificant? Surely even in Nazi Germany their achievements were known. Operation Paperclip is mentioned once in passing as a development of Project Overcast, 4 pages from the end. It is this kind of lack of development that is this book's big weakness. It's great as far as it goes, it just leaves you not really knowing any more than when you picked it up. I guess if you know nothing at all about von Braun, it's a good introduction. Disappointing though if you already knew about who he was. And that is the thing about this book. As far as it goes, it is very good, and it does put things in historical perspective, and it is good about his early life. However, it glosses over Operation Paperclip and bringing all the Nazis that America wanted to the USA and what happened with them, ignoring their past just so that they could have them create a rocket program, which would eventually become the Apollo program, which is an entire minefield in and of its own. The fact that he doesn't really talk about Goddard or Parsons, fathers of modern rocketry. Von Braun became the Disney frontman of the space race for America with his German accent, It's a strange book. I did enjoy reading it, but I was left feeling that it could have gone a lot further and should have gone a lot further than it did. So I am on the lookout for another book about Werner von Braun. I already knew an awful lot about it. I've got books about Jack Parsons as well, so I know a bit about Jack Parsons, quite a lot about Jack Parsons. And also Operation Paperclip and what went on there and the Apollo thing. So I know where he fits in, but it doesn't go into the fact that even his contemporaries didn't rate him as a scientist or an engineer. He wasn't that talented, yet he's credited with the Apollo space program being the father of all that. That's the thing about it. He was a bit of a gobshite, and he was just quite good on camera, and he was an opportunist. Not a bad book. I gave it 3 stars. It could have been better. Maybe I'll find another book that actually does tell more of the story. We'll have to wait and see. Mad Doctors, Monsters and Mummies. Lobby card posters from Hollywood Horrors by Dennis Gifford, editor. Now, me and Dennis Gifford go way back. Back to the, 1970s, early mid-70s. I got a book called The Pictorial History of Horror Movies, which was by Dennis Gifford. And he is an authority on horror movies. And it was reading his book, Pictorial History of Horror Movies, that got me into the history of the genre and wanting to know more about these things, because I was fascinated. Because in the early 70s, they actually showed this stuff on TV. I used to watch all the old movies from the 30s and 40s and 50s. I used to sit there and watch them because, well, that was what was on TV. You didn't have multiple channels like you do today, so you watched what was on. And I developed a fascination for all these old films. In the 1970s, these were only 30, 40 years old. It's not like today where they're getting on for 90. These were still fairly recent. It was a very different time, and Dennis Gifford was a big part of that, as was Alan G. Frank. And I've got another Dennis Gifford book, Movie Monsters, which is a much older book. But he was one of the things I learnt a lot from reading Dennis Gifford books. So when I saw Mad Doctors, Monsters and Mummies lobby card posters from the Hollywood Horrors, I thought, I've got to have that. So I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed going through this book. It's just a series of reprinted lobby cards, so it's not a great deal of reading. But if you love that kind of thing, the artwork and what have you, this is a fascinating little tome. So what I wrote on August the 16th, 2025 was, let's face it, if you're even considering buying this, you know what it is, and like me, you'll be happy with what you get. Each page features a cinema lobby card reproduction, and it's a tidy little book. They're all B-movies, some you'll be familiar with, others are pretty obscure, all are just brilliant. It's not high art in any way, shape or form, but it will make you smile. Nice little addition to the collection. That's it. That's all there is to say on it. If you are a fan of the old horror movies, then you will love this book. There's no two ways about it. It's just a wonderful little book. And that was the end of the third podcast of books that I read in 2025. And it was a mixed bag, but I hope you enjoyed it. On to the next one.